Hello, welcome back to the Dusty Codex. We are taught that the age of discovery began with Columbus and 3 small, desperate ships bobbing across the Atlantic. But 80 years before Columbus, the Pacific and Indian Oceans were dominated by a fleet that makes the Santa Maria look like a toy boat. We are always curious to know where our stories are traveling to and where your corner of the world is. Please take a moment to let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. In 1405, the Ming Dynasty of China launched the first of 7 massive expeditions. This wasn't just exploration, it was shock and awe. The fleet consisted of over 300 ships and 28,000 men, sailors, soldiers, doctors, and diplomats. At the helm was one of history's most unlikely heroes, Zheng He. He was a Muslim, a eunuch, and a giant of a man who rose from a prisoner of war to become the right hand of the emperor. They sailed to the ends of the known world. They brought back jewels, kings, and strange beasts, including a giraffe that the Chinese believed was a mythical qilin. They projected soft power on a global scale. And then they vanished. In one of the most baffling policy shifts in history, the emperor ordered the ships burned and the logs destroyed. China turned inward, and the greatest navy the world had ever seen was erased from memory. The fleet was the dream of the Yongle emperor. He was a usurper who had seized the throne from his nephew. To legitimize his rule, he wanted to show the world the overwhelming glory of the Ming Dynasty. He didn't want to conquer the world. He wanted the world to bow to him. Zheng He, originally named Ma He, was captured as a boy during the Ming conquest of Yunnan. Castrated and placed in the service of the prince, the future Yongle emperor, he proved himself a brilliant soldier and a loyal strategist. When the prince rebelled and took the throne, Zheng He was there. As a reward, the new emperor gave him the ultimate command. Go to the Western Oceans. Make the whole world acknowledge our mandate. The ships they built were technological marvels. The flagship Baochuan, treasure ships, were behemoths. Accounts describe them as 400 feet long and 160 feet wide. European ships of the time were lucky to have 3 masts. These had 9. They utilized watertight compartments to prevent sinking, technology the West wouldn't adopt for centuries. They grew soybeans in tubs on board to provide vitamin C, preventing scurvy long before James Lind. The construction effort was staggering. Entire forests were felled. The Longjiang shipyard in Nanjing became the industrial heart of the world, churning out a fleet that could carry enough men to populate a small city. In 1405, the first voyage launched. They sailed first to Champa, Vietnam, then to Java, Sumatra, and Malacca. Everywhere they went, the sheer size of the fleet ended arguments before they began. Zheng He wasn't just sailing, he was building a network. He established depots in Malacca, clearing out pirates to ensure safe trade. He wasn't conquering territory, but he was aggressively managing the trade routes. It wasn't always peaceful. In 1407, the pirate king Chen Zhuyi, who controlled the Strait of Malacca, tried to loot the fleet. Zheng He didn't hesitate. He annihilated the pirate fleet, killed 5,000 pirates, and took Chen Zhuyi back to Nanjing for execution. The message was clear. The Ming Emperor protects the seas. They pushed further west, to the great spice port of Calicut in India. Here they traded Chinese silk and porcelain, the finest in the world, for pepper, pearls, and precious stones. In Sri Lanka, a local king, Alagakonara, refused to pay tribute and tried to plunder the ships. Zheng He launched a lightning round raid with 2,000 troops, captured the king and his family, and hauled them back to China to apologize to the emperor. This was the ultimate shock and awe. The emperor didn't execute the Sri Lankan king. He released him and sent him home. It was a demonstration of supreme confidence. China didn't need your land. It just needed your submission. It's important to understand that this was not colonization in the European sense. Zheng He didn't leave behind governors or forts to tax the locals. He left behind stone stelaes, monuments inscribed with messages of peace and the emperor's greatness. This was soft power armed with 28,000 swords. The goal was the tribute system. If you acknowledged that China was the center of the world, China would shower you with gifts and protection. It was a diplomatic relationship, enforced by the most terrifying navy on earth. If these stories, where history turns not on conquest, but on prestige and the projection of sheer, overwhelming scale, are what you seek, I invite you to subscribe to the Dusty Codex. On the later voyages, the fleet reached the Persian Gulf and the Swahili coast of East Africa, modern Kenya and Somalia. They were now thousands of miles from home, further than any Chinese fleet had ever gone. In Bengal, envoys from Malindi presented Zheng He with a giraffe. The Chinese had never seen such a creature. They identified it as the xilin, a mythical beast said to appear only during the reign of a sage emperor. Bringing the xilin back to the emperor was a propaganda coup. It was proof that heaven smiled upon the Ming Dynasty. The fleet returned with zebras, lions, and ostriches, a zoo of tribute. But back in Beijing, the political winds were shifting. The voyages were incredibly expensive. The scholar bureaucrats, who followed the teachings of Confucius, hated the voyages. They hated the cost, they hated the foreign influence, and most of all, they hated the eunuchs like Zheng He who led them. The empire was also fighting expensive wars against the Mongols and building the massive Forbidden City. The treasury was draining. The scholars argued that the tribute brought back, giraffes and jewels, did not pay for the cost of the fleet. In 1424, the Yongle emperor died. His son, the Hongxi emperor, was conservative. He listened to the scholars. He immediately ordered the voyages to stop. Zheng He was grounded. There was one final voyage in 1431 under the Xuande emperor, a last hurrah. Zheng He, now an old man, revisited his depots, restoring order. But on the return journey, in 1433, the great admiral died at sea. With Zheng He dead, the Confucian faction won. They didn't just stop the voyages. They tried to erase them. The Minister of War, Liu Daxia, famously seized the charts, the logs, and the technical blueprints of the treasure ships and burned them. The great shipyards were shut down. It became a capital offense to build a ship with more than 2 masts. The greatest navy in history was left to rot in the water. China entered a period of isolationism, the Haijin sea ban. They literally turned their back on the ocean, believing that the Middle Kingdom needed nothing from the barbarian world. The withdrawal of the Chinese fleet created a massive power vacuum. Less than 70 years later, in 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and entered the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese arrived in tiny, heavily armed ships. They didn't find a massive Chinese police force to stop them. They found open seas. They proceeded to capture the very trade nodes, Malacca, Hormuz, that Zheng He had established. Zheng He is still remembered in Southeast Asia. Temples are dedicated to him, but in China, he was largely forgotten for centuries, a footnote in the dynastic records. Only recently has the full scale of his achievement been recognized. In 2010, a rudder post was found that suggests the ships truly were as big as the legends say. The treasure fleet remains one of history's most haunting images. It was a moment when China stood on the brink of becoming the world's first global superpower, peaceful and open, and then chose to close the door. We are left to wonder, if the treasure fleet had continued, would Columbus have arrived in America only to find a Chinese flag already planted on the shore?